So this afternoon, we'll have Azza, my friend Azza Kairanisa, present for the first time in Deconstructing Indonesia. Azza and I are old friends. I watched her project develop, and I'm very, very proud and happy to see how far the project has developed. Azza will be talking about Indonesia and the many names that we've forgotten on the way to our current understanding of what the archipelago is, and throughout the many different iterations of how our history has been told. So this is how things are going to go. Azza will speak for about 35 minutes. Then Auf will respond. Auf and I will both comment on Azza's presentation. We'll try to keep our remarks brief. I'd say around 10 to 15 minutes. And after that, we'll open the floor to discussion. And I really look forward to having a fruitful discussion with all of you. But without further ado, Azza, take it away.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here. This is really exciting. I think this is the first session in person, as Brian said, and thank you, Al, for organizing this in person, and for to Alf and Brian for agreeing to be my discussant today. Yeah, so a little bit about me is I'm actually a trained historian within the early modern, specifically in the Islamic early modern. So I don't actually do Indonesian history. This is a bit too contemporary for me. But my positionality is that I didn't grow up here. And so this is more of my intellectual quest in figuring out what it means to be Indonesian. As when I came back into Indonesia, a lot of people commented on my clumsy Indonesian and my lack of knowledge of norms and customs. So it was sort of my attempt at trying to figure out what that Indonesianness that I lacked really was. And yeah, so I think we should begin. But before really getting into the meat of it, so I asked Derek, who might be asleep right now, but I asked Derek to co-lecture this session with a professor. But unfortunately, the professor passed away last week, and he was Professor Jess Ariando at FKMUI. He was very, very brilliant, very, very generous with his knowledge, very, very fun as well. He made talking to him and all his stories really, really fun. And you might be wondering, as a historian, why am I talking to someone in public health? Well, he was specializing in biostatistics and specifically surveys and fieldwork. So he went all over the archipelago talking to all these local leaders and custodians and building trust with them. So he had genealogies and oral testimonies that perhaps don't make it into public discourse. So we had a plan to sort of turn what he knew, this knowledge that he knew through these conversations he had, into a publication. And we wanted to write on the transnational history of Indonesia. And you have to bear with me and this word transnational, because I know it's kind of still loaded and implies a nation state unit, but I'm currently unsure of what else to use. I like connected histories, but we'll go on to that a little later. This presentation is going to be split up into three main parts. So we have the necessity of the nation, the success of the nation, and the alternatives of self-conception. And then we'll kind of circle back into a transnational history of Indonesia and that idea. And so going on to the first part, last lecture with Derek, we talked about, this whole module is about modernity. And the last lecture, Derek mentioned maju and modern, and to be maju is to be modern. To be ahead is to be modern. And this is the modern world, but the qualifiers are all written by Europe and the empires. And so, and again, like this module has referred to Dipesh Chakrabarty's idea of the waiting room of history a lot, how the rest of the world is in the waiting room of history while Europe continues to progress and develop. It's like they don't exist until they're interacting with Europe. And a way to keep people in the past is to take hold of periodization in history. And if you look at this is the periodization from the Faculty of History at Oxford Uni. Specifically, the syllabus says Europe and its engagements with the non-Europe world. So you can see that all of these moments are big parts of, in specifically European history, but this is largely how in the scholarly world we understand history to have unfolded. But like I saw this post on Instagram, if we did the same thing for other regions, you could say the Civil War in America was also the late Tokugawa period in Japan. And it's interesting to see that we, like, obviously the rest of the world wasn't just static while Europe was involved and like going through history. They also were making history as well. And I think what we see is, if we go back to the other one, so we see the Middle Ages, and we see that was once referred to, it's a retired term, but it was once referred to as the Dark Ages, because it was presumed that there wasn't any literary output or art made, and there was little intellectual progress. At the same time, that was the height of the Islamic Golden Age. So that was when Baghdad and Cordoba and Toledo were becoming key centers of Islamic knowledge production. So the rest of the world clearly wasn't in the Dark Ages, seems to have just been Europe. But this mechanism is actually still a little bit incorrect, because it turns out there were literary outputs, a lot of intellectual progress as well. It's just that when it got to the late medieval world and the early modern, they projected backwardness onto the Middle Ages, decided to call it dark to highlight their forwardness, their modernity. And so we see this as how they kind of coin modernity and establish modernity on their terms, and then assume that they are in the most progressive, the better, the more ideal part of history, whereas the other and the before are backwards. I also missed a point, but it's interesting, the Enlightenment period as well. We think of it as the key indicator of intellectual progress. But of course, that knowledge was written by Muslim scholars in Central Asia. So it's less enlightenment for the rest of the world, more enlightenment in Europe, and more Europe catching up to what the rest of the world, well, like Eurasia and further east, knew already. Not representative. And we see this in the Latinization of Ibn Sina to Avicenna, who became like this big name in intellectual progress at that time. But of course, a key part of modernization is also the nation state. And so to be modern is to also be a nation state, to fit in this category. And that is a key part of this necessity of the nation. And if we talk about the nation state moment, as an early modernist, I actually don't really like this moment. It's very disruptive to history. And I think a lot of early modernists think the same, but it is a real thing that happened, and it was a very necessary thing that happened. And it was something that happened in reaction to colonialism. I think after 1945 and the end of the World War, a lot of countries who were under rule were trying to establish their independence, but to do so, they had to adopt the grammar of the European nation state to convince them that they too were worthy of being sovereign. And so I want to refer to another thinker that's been often referred to in this lecture series, but Chatterjee's idea of nationalism as a derivative of discourse. We can only understand ourselves in the modular forms that were already written out in Europe. That's the whole idea of we have to make ourselves something they recognize and something they can legitimize. And then there's also Homi Bhabha's idea in location of culture of the narrative nation, which is, it's sort of a performance. It's a lot of rituals. It's a lot of, just performing that we are a unified entity, and that can be maybe Independence Day and our national flag and our anthems and our constitutions and things. And then, of course, in the outside performance and the outside conviction, there is also, on the other hand, Benedict Anderson's imagined communities. So there's a real sense of belonging, a real sense of community, that even though we before had never existed as a unified entity, eventually we now exist, even though we will not meet all our neighbors. We will, put our lives on the line for them, essentially. I also want to just really quickly interject and say, this need to convince other entities to legitimize us is, we have to understand that it was also a bestowing of sovereignty as opposed to earning of sovereignty. And I think in Simone de Beauvoir's The Second Sex, which is feminist literature, but she does mention that women aren't truly free we have just been given enough liberties to appease us. And that was during her time. And then now we see that, oh, we are only free in the terms that Europe can understand us to exist. So is it really liberation the way Europe sees it to be, or is it like, conditional freedom? And then I want to go back to Benedict Anderson's Imagined Communities, because really early on in his books, he highlights paradoxes that the historian and the nationalists will encounter. And this whole thing kind of rests on the second paradox, which is the formal universality of nationality as a social cultural concept. In the modern world, everyone can, would, will have, should, will have a nationality as he or she has a gender, versus the particularities of its concrete manifestations. And so we know that in this world, we have to have a nationality at this time. There is no other choice but to have a nationality. And we know that to be stateless is not the preferable choice. And so this is where the necessity of the nation comes from. And so our nation building, like most post-colonial states, we filled up the colonial borders that existed before us. So we see the VOC, and they had borders. They were like, this is our colonial lines, and we built ourselves up in order so that we would not be recolonized. And this is something that happens a lot, but we have to understand this isn't representative of pre-VOC or even the existing lived experiences of sovereign and autonomous states at that moment. And again, this isn't new. And I think a more concrete example that might help by comparing it to this is the scramble for Africa, where Europe decided they wanted to colonize Africa. They came in and they drew a bunch of borders, completely nothing to do with the communities and tribes and societies that lived there, but more so which resources can they negotiate and have access to. This is why we have so many straight lines in Africa, when cultures generally are not that static and cannot be boxed in that way. This is why if you look at where Egypt is, there's a straight line in the south, but we know that ancient Egypt extended all the way to Sudan. So it messes with our understanding of history. Yes. And so I was trying to figure out, how do I show everybody the malleableness, the dynamism of sovereignty and autonomous states before the VOC and Indonesia came aboard, because we didn't have strict borders. So these are all the centers of important polities, and these are their boundaries. And you can see they're not they're not strict, they're not concrete boundaries, and they changed a lot. They fluctuated very, very frequently, but this is roughly the entities that were somewhat autonomous before the VOC and before Indonesia and those concrete concepts. And it was really hard to find a map, actually, to find a map of this is from the Age of Commerce, and it's made by Anthony Reid, and it's supposed to depict the 1600s political centers, and it was really hard. I couldn't find any. There were some archival ones, but they weren't representative of actual landmass. They focused mostly on coastal cities and the harsh waterways there, the oceans in between. And I realized that, oh, it's really silly actually of me to think there is a map of this region, because again, this region before the VOC wasn't ever concretely one singular thing. So I fell for it, but it was a teleological trap. I know now that we're a nation state, and I know now that we're one cohesive political category. And I projected that backwards, which is a real anachronism, and something that I still, I guess, really need to put into practice, because yeah, I have to address the fact that this idea of Indonesia or the archipelago as being a cohesive singular thing didn't exist at that time. And this is the real thing that we need to understand. And this is why Indonesia is, of course, an imagined community, but a very successful imagined community. Yes. And this brings us to the second part on the success of the nation. And I want to share a little bit. So when Brian and I were in uni, the college I was at, St. Catherine's College, was the college the first Prime Minister of Malaysia attended. And so there's a really strong Malay World Study Center. They had lectures every couple weeks, I think, during term, and it was really busy. There were a lot of people who came. Indonesia was a subject quite often. We had students from Malaysia, Singapore, there were some students from the Philippines and Thailand, and some students from Brunei as well, who attended and who actively participated. But what I really saw a lack of was Indonesian students. And Dr. Liana Chua, the convener of this lecture series, when I went and asked her, do you not see a lot of Indonesians who come to this lecture series? She said she didn't even realize there were that many Indonesian students at Cambridge. But there's like a decent number of us, and there are a decent number also focusing on this part of the world. So I was quite shocked. And she said, no, they don't attend these, or they don't at least make themselves known. So then I went and I asked PPI, the Indonesian Student Association, I was like, oh, there's this really cool lecture series. It's on the Malay world. Would you like to join? And a lot of the people who answered said, well, that's about Malaysia, no? It's the Malay world studies. It's not about Indonesia. But I'm like, oh, wow, our nation building is so successful. We can't see ourselves as anything else. And so, but then we have to remind ourselves that, and I think Alf can definitely comment on this later, on what the Malay world really refers to, and the people who, you know, are part of it, and everyone and all the languages, because it's Malay lingua franca, and it encompasses a lot more than just Malaysia. So then we can return to the name Indonesia. Is that what we are? But then if we really break it down and we deconstruct Indonesia, Indonesia is two Greek words put together. It's Indo and Nesos. It means East Islands. They're not very creative with this. And then and it was coined and made popular by two English anthropologists and geographers. So is this really representative of the history beyond 1945? And so the last name that's become increasingly more popular recently and has been almost like the indigenous authentic alternative has been Nusantara. Yeah. But Nusantara is also not a neutral term. Again, it was a Majapahit term specifically for the islands at the edge of the Japanese imagination, or under specifically through tribal tributaries and vassal states, made as vassal states. And so if we're trying to move away from narratives of subjugation, perhaps this isn't necessarily a word we want to choose either. And we have to understand Nusantara at the time it was used is very different to the Nusantara we use now as well. So I mean, using it now in modern terms means something completely different, and I'm sure it's appropriately used when it is used, but it's important not to project it beyond the time it existed in. And perhaps there is no point harmoniously that describes this part of the world, and also perhaps the absence is the point, like there is no map that has accurately depicted this part of the world before the 1600s. And this again goes back to Benedict Anderson's paradox, and this time the first one, which is the objective modernity of nations to the historian's eye versus their subjective antiquity in the eyes of the nationalists. We know as nationalists, we have to create a universal idea of Indonesia, and we have to, well, not just Indonesia, all nation states, to convince everyone, including ourselves and those outside, that we, again, are allowed to exist and are deserving of sovereignty and legitimacy. At the same time, we also understand as historians that the nation states and most nation states are very, very young, and they're still in their infancy. So this specific lecture isn't trying to dismantle Indonesia. I'm not trying to say the Republic is illegitimate either, but I'm just trying to say that now that we've succeeded so well, perhaps it's time to retrace our steps back to see what we lost in the nation building moment. Because, I mean, Benedict Anderson and also Robert Hefner talk about how the nation building moment requires amnesia to build a single cohesive unit as well. And so what is it that we lost to this amnesia? And as historians, I think that's where we should focus. And this is where what I'm trying to say as well. And I think that one of the biggest examples of anachronism and the nation pride, I think, is on Malahayati. So again, I focus on the Islamic early modern, which also includes Aceh, of course. And Professor Tris as well, this is one of his favorite examples of Malahayati, of a figure in the Indonesian history. And so Malahathi was recently made a national hero, which is kind of a loaded term because she existed she was born in 1550, died in 1695, I think, yeah. She was the first female of the modern world, still a loaded term, but she's very impressive for her time. And she killed Koning Hoopman in 1599. And as we know, he was the Dutch man who brought in all the Dutch companies into Indonesia. He came here first and said, hey, there's some real products to be sold here, went back to the Netherlands and called all his friends. And then we also know, well, the story goes that she led a naval fleet of widows in Valley who lost their husbands at war and at sea. So she's really, really cool. But is she a national hero? Because, I mean, again, the nation didn't exist. And also, like, if you really think about it, she wasn't working she wasn't working under the pretense that she was protecting a nation. I think her affiliations barely existed beyond the southern tip of Sumatra. Aceh at that time was the eastern frontier of the Ottoman Empire, and they saw themselves as part of the Islamic world, completely not part of Southeast Asia necessarily, or the archipelago further east. Additionally, this encounter with Cornelius de Hoopman wasn't necessarily colonial either. The story goes that Cornelius de Hoopman was being really annoying and arrogant, and the Sultan was like, you deal with this. And so she supposedly calls him onto a ship and then sort of does that. But then is it national really? I mean, I want to, again, on my quest to figure out what it means to be Indonesian, I would love to have her in my genealogy, and I would love to say that to be Indonesian is to be a fraction of what she was, but it's not historically accurate necessarily. So that is something to bear in mind when we talk about national narratives and history writing. Also, I'm sure Brian will talk to you about early historiography in Indonesia as well. And so what are we supposed to do? And this is how to retrace our way back to those old worlds. Also, because if we cut Malahayati and put her part of the national narrative, we don't see the worlds that she was part of, like the Islamic Indian Ocean, like the Ottoman Empire, like all those worlds beyond. And what I think that we should do to retrace our way back to those worlds is to let these entities and these polities, these actors, these agents exist in the time that they lived. And this is sort of a good example for it. And this is a quote from a French Jesuit traveler who came to the shores of Aceh. Again, I'm very focused on Aceh, but this is one of my researches. And it goes, imagine a forest of coconut trees, bamboos, pineapples, and bananas, through the midst of which passes quite a beautiful river, all covered with boats. Put in this forest an incredible number of houses, spread throughout this forest as many people as you see in your towns when they are well populated. You will form a pretty accurate idea of Aceh, and you will agree that a city of this new style can give pleasure to passing strangers. When one is at anchor, one sees not a single vestige or appearance of a city, because the great trees along the shore hide all its houses. And I really like this quote. So it was written in 1699. I really like this quote because we don't see any sense that the French Jesuit traveler believed Aceh to be backwards. So he recognized Aceh to be a city, even though it didn't at all resemble a European city or an East Asian city or a city in the Mediterranean, but he recognized it as a city. And then he also said new style. And we go back to the very start and this whole idea of to be maju is to be modern. Hopefully he didn't see Aceh as being backwards if he refers to it as a new style. And so this is how we return polities to their time to honor them, because given this, we know that at that point in history, supposedly this part of the world wasn't that far off and they weren't that backwards and they weren't behind or anything, but they were building and making history on their own terms, and which is very lovely. And this is a lovely prose as well. And so, I think the key things that we have to do is detangle from Dutch projections. So rethink, start rethinking ourselves outside of the VOC/Dutch East Indies borders. So our history doesn't end at those borders, and also move away from static categories to dynamic categories, like we saw with the Anthony Reid map. All these sultanates and kingdoms they didn't draw their borders like Westphalia, like Europe during the Westphalian treaties, but they allowed movement quite frequently. And so what did that really look like? and also understanding autonomy despite the larger box of the colonial constraints and container. So we know the VOC existed, but that didn't mean that immediately everything else ceased to exist and everything else was immediately the Dutch East Indies. So how did these autonomous states practice their autonomy, no matter what that looked like and to what extent? Because also, they engaged a lot with like entities outside of the VOC. And so Professor Triss has a really fun example of this. And he said a story of how the Dutch king to Bhutan, and they went onto the Sultan and asked, are you harboring the Sultan of Makassar on your land? Like, we believe you're harboring the Sultan of Makassar on your land. And they're like, no, we swear we do not harbor the Sultan of Makassar on our land. Like, he's not here, like, just go, he's not on this land. And it turns out they didn't say God's name in vain, but they did build a cave for him underground to hide from the Dutch. So it's like we see these moments and these little stories as them exercising their autonomy and collaborating with neighbors, but clearly they were still two distinct polities and belonged to two distinct sultanates, and even the Dutch seemed to understand that. Another story, oh, actually, no, I'll leave that for later. And then we can also start seeing the extents of where these polities went to. I'm sorry, I'm really focusing on Aceh here. This is a letter from Sultan al-Din al-Aqha, the second Sultan of Aceh, to Ottoman Sultan Sulaiman the Magnificent, big Ottoman Sultan. And so basically, he's asking for help on behalf of Aceh. But he refers to the land, to this region of the world as the land below the winds. So perhaps that's another word we can see ourselves in. And also, this is an example of if we go beyond the Dutch archives, we see a lot of us exercising our sovereignty to other states, which is nice because it's coming from us as opposed to being told as opposed to we're being the subject of a document, if that makes sense. Another really good document, which I've forgotten to add to this, is the letter from Sultan Iskandar Muda to King James I, which is at Oxford's Bodleian Library. And it's this very, very embellished letter, and it's all gold embellishments, and it's beautiful, but it's actually really passively, aggressively telling King James I, like, we don't agree with your terms of trade, and we want more. And eventually the British were like, okay, here are some more cannons and more artillery, please can you open your trade routes to us now? And they're like, okay, I guess if you have given us all of this. So this also shows that, hey, how did this tiny sultanate managed to negotiate against the British Empire? And it kind of readjusts our framing for where we stood in global history, which I think is very important. And so beyond the land of the winds, this is a map that I found when I was looking for a pre-1700s map of this region, and I've only found like Nanyang maps. This is upside down, so China's at the bottom, and then Sumatra's at the top, and then there's Java Major at the top. So Nanyang is another word that we could call ourselves in order to find our way back to these archives. Another one is Suvarnadvipa, the land of the gold by Indian traders. And the last is Jazair al-Jawi and Bilad al-Jawi. So the first one is the older name for the island of Jawi and the people who came from the island of Jawi, and also Bilad al-Jawi is a bit more recent. And to sort of string us, I want to end on something that'll hopefully bring us to the next module on Islam in Indonesia, I believe. And basically, we like to put Haji in our name if you've gone on Hajj, but that originated not from Muslims generally. It was actually asked of by the Dutch to be able to survey who went and did Hajj. And the concern for it is because people from Aceh, Minangkabau, Java, Banten, Bugis were all finally in one place in Mecca. And Michael Afan in Islamic Nationhood and Colonial Indonesia says that treats at least Mecca as an incubator for a pan-archipelago Islamic consciousness. So these people who would have never met each other if they had stayed in the archipelago suddenly all met in Mecca and started realizing how the extents of Dutch colonialism, and they brought back with them this like revolting spirit, like the revolutionary spirit. And then So this is where the early consciousness that brought forward the Tariqat Islam and the early forms of nationhood through the Islamic way. So yeah, if we start seeing ourselves as part of these different things, there's a lot more of history that we can find that you would lose if you stuck only by the Indonesian name. And yeah, I'm hoping that this lecture can really highlight how the magnitude of our place in global history. Just thank you.
Thank you so much, Azza. I chuckled a bit when Azza mentioned the manuscript in the Bodleian Library, because as Azza can attest, that manuscript has been a very important alibi for both me and Azza every time we visit Oxford. Because the Bodleian Library in Oxford has this scheme where you can get a reader's card as long as you write what it is you want to research in the Bodleian Library. Now, I do modern history, which means that I look at the 1900s onwards. But every time I go to Oxford, I become an early modernist because I need to enter the Bodleian Library, and that is the only manuscript I know exists. So Azza has helped me a lot in that regard. Thank you so much, Azza, for presenting. It was really lovely. I look forward to opening the floor for discussion with you. But before that, we'll have two short comments, first from Auf and then from me, which I hope will extend the discussion, and I hope will set the ground for the discussion we'll have later. So Auf, whenever you're ready, let's take
There's an Arabian word I wanna remember. Wait, there's a lot of words. Okay. Maybe it's yeah, thank you, Brian, for giving me the time and opportunity to comment on Azza's presentation. So, so my comment will be similar in structure with Azza. I will start with something personal. So the first time I met Azza is around 3 or 4 months ago, right?
Yeah.
And during the time, we are in the same conference, and my background is research in manuscript. So when we talk about an area or a subject we studied, we call it Nusantara as archipelago. But me myself, I don't agree with that term because of what Azza have been told you guys. And during that conference, when Azza have her time for presentation, I was like, this is my people. So yeah, after that, and yeah, we have a meeting with Derek, and yeah, and here we are. What I want to comment about your presentation is actually nothing because I'm agree with almost everything, but there's a note I like to provide context that I know a little bit. Yeah, European model concept of identity. I think if you guys ever joined previous Deconstructing Indonesia session with Derek already talked about Hope's social contract. So the nation state concept, as Ben Anderson explained, mostly about it emerged as something that is ironic because nation used to be a counter of the state. So let's say the state 100 years ago was Dutch East Indies. The nation is local people, and local people are most of them they are against the state. But the emergence of how nation and state become one entities is mostly a European model of social contract. When in reality, we never have once a contract that we should be in the same in the same belonging. I think I will revert to one of the most authoritative history book, which is Sejarah Melayu, written in 1612. So the book, other name is Sulalatu Saladin. Even when we say sejarah, sejarah came from this book, the title of this book. And Sejarah Melayu is actually a genealogical book that trace all the kings and rulers of Melayu. But the book never even mentioned orang Melayu. So even the Melayu itself was never an ethnicity. Bugis, Makassar, Java, and everything else is it made by the colonial, so they could put us in the box. So for yeah, for a census. And I think I will cite what two of scene in the Sejarah Melayu. So I think when we talk about identity, as I mentioned before, we never have a map, a single map. So the idea of identity based on geography is colonial product. So how we imagine ourselves before colonialism during the pre-modern era. So there is a question, right? When we were asked, kamu orang mana? So what kamu orang mana actually means? Is it where do you from? Is it asking about place, or is it asking about our origin? Where are you? Where's your origin? Is it about where or what? So kamu orang mana? What kind of people are you? So we don't know actually how to translate this. But in Sejarah Melayu, at least there are two dialogue. The first one is on the chapter 14. So there was Raja Suran. So Raja Suran is like, yeah, king. He's a king. So King Suran was asked by random quality, like, kamu orang mana? And he answered, I'm the descendant of Alexander the Great. Wow, Alexander the Great, a figure that so far away in the Persia or in the Greek. How people in Malay world admit themselves as the descendant of Alexander the Great. So the question is never actually about geographical. It's about cosmological, because most of Malay manuscript, I think you know too, it's always start from the descendant of Alexander the Great. So it's a myth, of course. But the point is, we cannot right now we forget how in the past our people imagine themselves as a community. So for example, the word Melayu is never about ethnicity or people. It's about the relation between rulers and subject. Because in another chapter, chapter 201, there is an envoy of the king, Tun Mamat. So Tun Mamat was asked the similar question, and his answer is not, saya orang Melayu, tak. He said, saya orang Melaka, because his king is from the Malacca kingdom. So the answer is always about who you work for, who you serve for, or if you are king, who's my ancestors? So the answer is always about genealogy, because before geography exists in our region, how people making space, making authority is through genealogical, through genealogy and not geography. So if you look into a lot of manuscript, you may not find a single geographic map, because people imagine their territory not by borders or land, but mostly about how far our blood flows. If our blood flows into another land, that's where you belong to. Yeah, I think, yeah, pretty much it is. I can add for this one. Oh yeah, I like how Azza said about the myth of Kumala Hayati, right? So yeah, even the idea of national hero is abstract. not only because it says it shows teleological trap, but it also shows that our history is built on a myth, because the concept of hero and villain is mostly fictional. So how we look into our history that is built on the fact through myth. So that's kind of absurd, because if we look into other examples, like my yeah, like in Bugis, yeah, um Arung Palaka was considered as a villain just because he worked with the Dutch to save his own people from another colonizer in Makassar. So that's absurd to say this one is hero and this one is villain even before the nation even created. So I'm not anti-nationalist, but I think this discourse should solve more. So yeah, I really like the presentation. It's really helpful. I think for the modern history perspective, Brian know better.
That's very. Thanks so much
Yeah.
for your really interesting comments that really build on what Azza said. I can't promise that I will be able to succeed on the modern front, but I will do my best. I have 10 minutes. So what I really want to do in these 10 minutes is to build on what Azza told us by asking a follow-up question, which is why? Why and how did we lose sight of alternatives to the nation state in history writing? How is it that visions such as the Malay world, Pan-Islamism, the land below the winds, how is it that we have come to forget about these and not take them seriously in history writing today? And I'll do that through 3 interconnected points. I'll try to keep this brief. So my hypothesis is that the reason why we've lost sight of these visions is that in the formative moment in which our national history was written in the 1940s, the dominant mode of history writing was one driven by fear that they could not take the nation state for granted, that it could unravel at any moment, and that history should serve to make sure that it does not crumble, to make sure that the nation stays intact. In fact, Sukarno himself candidly said this in a speech in 1948, when he said that the goal of national historiography should be to show that a nation with a glorious past, that could trace its past to Majapahit and Sriwijaya, must have a glorious future. A nation with that impressive of a past must have the resources to move forward and withstand outside pressures. But what were these outside pressures? I mean, there were a few. One important one was subnational sovereignties, rebellions such as the DETE rebellion and other forces that sought to tear the nation apart at its seams. But also something that is less remarked on, but is just as important, is Javanese nationalism. In the 1920s and 30s, there were a group of Javanese nationalists who framed the idea that Java should become part of a larger Indonesian nation, an Indish nation, as sacrifice. They thought that Java was too high of a civilization to condescend to become part of an Indonesian unity. And nationalist historians were, in essence, fighting against these tendencies. They were writing narratives that sought to bolster the nation in light of all these pressures that sought to tear the nation apart. And these histories looked, well, they look very different, but there are a few examples. Has anyone here come across Muhammad Yamin's 6,000-year-old history of the Indonesian flag? So this was the dominant mode of history writing. That is probably one of the most famous examples. And it's these kinds of histories, right? Romantic histories about national heroes, about that traced the Indonesian nation back thousands of years into the past. But what brought all of these works together was that they saw the messy patchwork of the early modern past, the past that Azza has just told you about, as necessarily leading towards the Indonesian nation state, the modern nation state. So all of that, Majapahit, the connection to the Ottoman world, the exploits of heroes such as Sultan Agung, right? All of those stories led to the nation state, were read through the lens of the nation state. They were so all of that was brought together under the label Indonesian. Now, what's interesting is that this isn't something that is limited to the 1940s and 50s. This continues to happen today. In a recent book by Adam Babette, The Pulse of the Earth, which is a brilliant book by right, a real intervention in the history of science, there is a throwaway comment where he said that Sultan Agung was an anti-colonial leader, and his revolts were anti-colonial in nature. Now, I found that quite interesting, and when I encountered this in a seminar, I remember us dwelling on it for a bit, because it isn't self-evident that Sultan Agung was an anti-colonial leader. He was fighting for his own purposes. He didn't have the nation in mind. And yet, when we think about him today, we think about him as a precursor to the Pemuda and the nationalists, who then formed the Indonesian nation state. But let's go back to the 1950s and 60s for a bit, right? Because we've spoken about the nationalist historiographies that were very clearly romantic and moralizing. But there was a separate thread of history that aimed to be more scientific, quote unquote. These were the historians such as Sartono Kartabirjo and Ong Kok Ham, people who were trained in Yale and Cornell, who saw themselves as new social historians and who wanted to write objective histories that moved past nationalist accounts, right? And it is true that that they dealt with nationalism and teleology in a more sophisticated way. Sartono, for example, in his most famous book, The 1888 Peasants' Revolt of Banten, saw the 1888 revolt, right, not as an anti-colonial revolt, but a millenarian one, right? One that hoped for the Ratu Adil to come. It wasn't a precursor to nationalist movements. But at the same time, even Sartono could not escape the trap of reading nationalism into the early modern past. He was once asked, Sartono Kartabirjo, in a conference called IAHA, the International Association of Historians of Asia, about whether or not he thought it was important to place Indonesian history, especially 19th century Indonesian history, as part of a broader Southeast Asian story. Should we read Indonesia as part of a broader Southeast Asian experience? And what Sartono said was interesting. He said, no, because what matters now is that the nations of Southeast Asia, this was in the 1950s, by the way, wrote their own national histories, and only later should we gather those histories together and form a cohesive history of Southeast Asia. So it really showed what was on his mind. What was on his mind was the same thing, was the same stuff that preoccupied Muhammad Yamin and the other historians who wrote, these weird histories of the Indonesian flag. So it was very much the dominant culture to read the nation state back into the early Roman past. But now I want us to zoom in on a special case. There is one possibility, there is one juncture in which the history of Indonesia could have been part of a broader Asian history. And that was during the 1970s and 80s with the Greater India School. In the 1970s and 80s, there was a group of historians in India who looked back to the year 750 to 1750 and saw that South Asia and Southeast Asia shared similar religious and political developments. Religiously, they were both part of the Sanskrit cosmopolis in Sheldon Pollock's words. Right? All of the places as far as Goa and the southern coast of Java, for instance, shared Sanskrit and used Sanskrit in inscriptions and caves, for instance. And they were in these polities, right, along this 1,000-year stretch, were organized according to the same political principles. right? There was first a wave of frontier empires, such as Vijayanagara in India and Demak in Java, for instance, which sought to expand on two frontiers, the frontier of the sea and the frontier of the arid inland zone, right? So they were very, very similar developments. And all of this to say, it's very easy to get lost in the details, but the upshot of all this, the argument, the central argument of these historians, was that you can understand South and Southeast Asia, Java and the south of India, as part of the same cohesive unity, as part of the same story. But this intellectual wave didn't take root. It didn't develop very far. And the reason was because it was rejected by post-colonial historians of India and Indonesia in the same period, because they weren't happy. Even historians of India, right, were not happy to know that India was not exceptional. And the same went for Indonesian historians as well. If all of these political and religious patterns were shared, then any claim to Indonesian or Indian exceptionalism would fall flat. And so we saw this vision collapse in the 1970s and 80s. But my final point, this is my third point, right, is these alternative visions that Azza is so brilliantly described in her presentation are not limited to the early modern period. They persisted even as far as decolonization, the 1950s and 60s. Even after decolonization, it wasn't clear that Indonesia, Kenya, Malaysia, Singapore would become nation states. There were so many competing visions at play. I want us to travel a bit further now to Africa and to think of Pan-Africanism. When Senegal became independent, there were fierce debates about whether or not Senegal should become a nation state. Leopold Sédar Senghor and Haïm Césaire, right, two anti-colonial thinkers at the time, were not fans of the nation-state model. In fact, what they wanted instead was a French union, where Senegal remained part of the French colonial empire, but had its own parliament, had its own voting rights, could determine its own laws, and had special economic agreements with France, or with the France metropole. So it wasn't clear that after decolonization, in our case, after 1949, the political form that would come to be was the nation state, right? It could have been anything else. Samuel Aydin, for instance, has spoken in his books about pan-Islamism, right? The idea that Islamic states should band together after decolonization in order to avoid being recolonized, and to join together under the banner of the Ummah. But all of this to say, right, that the nation state is not something that we can take for granted. And this is the note that I want to end on. I want us to look forward a bit, and I hope this will carry into our discussion later. One of my favorite articles in there, I work on Indonesian humanities, right, on the history of Indonesian humanities, and there's so few articles about this out there. But there's one that I keep on coming back to because it's one of the few that exist. And that's by Anthony Reid. He once wrote an article on the global humanities in Indonesia. And his argument, in essence, was this: for as long as the Indonesian humanities have existed, right? So in the FIB, in UGM and UI, for instance, and in their previous colonial iterations, what the Indonesian humanities has looked like was, it looked like an effort to understand usness. What does it mean to be Indonesian? What makes Indonesia exceptional? What makes us different from the rest of the world? And it's been very successful in doing that. And as we've discussed, there was a clear reason to do that, right? Because as a young nation, Indonesia needed to figure out what it was, what differed it from other places, and the humanities could help. But Reid says, and I agree, that that moment has passed. And right now, the humanities should serve a different purpose. And that is to place Indonesia in a broader global story. And instead of asking what makes Indonesia exceptional, it should ask, what can Indonesia offer the world, and how has Indonesia existed in the world? There are many refreshing trends in this direction. My supervisor, my ex-supervisor, Rachel Yao, for instance, has written a book about the Nanyang that positions, it's coming out next year, where she positions Indonesia within a broader story of the southern seas. And my current supervisor, Michael Laughlin, has written about Uma Below the Winds, placing Indonesian nationalism within a broader story of Islamic modernism, for instance. I really believe that this is the direction that the Indonesian humanities should move towards. And it's the work that I hope that many of us can do as scholars of Indonesian humanities. But then again, a lot of work remains to be done, and I look forward to engaging with that work when it comes. Okay, shall we open the floor for?
Yeah,
I think we should.
sure.
Okay, any questions? Okay, let's take two first. Yes.
No.
Did I?
And the one.
Hi, I'm Yogi. I study public international law, and with an interest in third world approaches to international law. And so this presentation has been really great, and it's great to see some parallels. You know, when you mentioned to be modern is to be the nation state, in TWAIL approaches, we talk about, you know, to be modern or to be a subject of international law is to be a nation state. And so the areas of contestation from global South countries to reclaim you know, legal system that is Eurocentric and is set to oppress us. I've sort of two quick questions. So, Brian, you mentioned earlier in your first point that it's like this because in the formative moments when history was written, there was a real fear of the unraveling. I kind of don't disagree with that. And so, because it is, you know, important, we did face many threats. I mean, after proclaiming independence, we were faced with two subsequent military aggressions from the Dutch. So I do think that this sort of nation building is important. My question would just be, you know, okay, so where would the limits be in your opinion? In a sense of why then is it important to learn about these alternatives? Beyond just, hey, learning about history is really important, but like in your opinion, maybe if you were to come across these sorts of pushbacks and arguments about exceptionalism, what would be your response in terms of, hey, actually learning about these alternatives is really important, beyond that is just fascinating. And then my second just really quick question is when talking about these contestations, you mentioned the Greater India School. I would probably also point to an effort with the Bandung Conference, the Asia African Conference. I don't know if maybe you have any perspectives on that as an effort to you know, contest the nation state in a sense of, okay, let's talk not just about Indonesian exceptionalism, but now let's talk about global South, more broadly exceptionalism through that conference. In 1955, yeah, 1955.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, Mike.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, that's
Sure.
Yeah.
By the way, is it okay if I talk in Indonesia? I mean, like,
Sure.
okay. Because I'm quite insecure with my music skills. Okay, anyway, before I'm gonna start my question, I would like to respond that I'll say. Aku teringat sama satu buku yang ditulis tahun 2024 judulnya Subjek Sunda. Dan apa namanya, buku itu tuh mengingatkan bahwasannya etnis-etnis yang kita pegang sekarang gitu ya, itu kayak contoh saya orang Jawa gitu, kemudian teman-teman orang orang Bugis dan seterusnya, pada akhirnya itu bukan sesuatu yang dari sananya gitu ya, bukan sesuatu yang udah ada prakolonial, tapi rupanya itu it's situated by colonial itself gitu. Jawa pada akhirnya yang aku alami adalah Jawa yang kolonial gitu, bukan Jawa yang Jawa tua, aku nggak tahu apa maksudnya. But anyway, um, apa namanya, mengingatkan pula pada teori Leonard Andaya soal Mandala. Em, Bagaimana rupanya state itu kayaknya nggak akan pernah bisa di Indonesia, Nusantara atau archipelagis, tempat yang archipelagis gitu. Karena ya cair ya, ada cair, batas-batas yang cair gitu. Ini ada satu temuan yang menarik gitu, di bukunya, kalau mungkin teman-teman tahu, Nenek Moyangku Seorang Anarkis gitu. Barangkali agak berat untuk menaruh anarkisme di apa di Nusantara gitu ya. But ada gejala, aku pribadi nganggapnya itu sebagai gejala anarkisme gitu ya, gejala stateless gitu. Dan yang terakhir ini sih, aku by the way jurusanku sejarah. Sekarang lagi tertarik banget, kalau misal Auf kan juga anak sejarah, tertarik sama filologi gitu. Aku mendasarkan diriku pada kajian budaya gitu, dan aku punya interest sama pendudukan Jepang gitu. Ada satu paper, ada satu artikel ilmiah yang itu aku lupa tahun ditulis sama siapa. Intinya bagaimana Jepang itu punya kerangka co-prosperity sphere gitu ya. Rupanya dalam temuannya India juga termasuk Asia Raya. Pertanyaanku sederhana sih, mungkin a quick question. Jangan-jangan kayak apakah nasionalisme juga itu tuh selalu akan disituasikan oleh siapa yang berkuasa gitu loh, gitu. Itu aja sih, coba. Terima kasih.
Ada pertanyaan online juga ya. Sebentar. Would you like to go as well?
Or maybe two first.
Two first? Okay.
You wanna
For a
start?
second. Yeah. So yeah, I agree. The legal systems. I really like Hannah Arendt's work on the origins of totalitarianism, because it says that, you know, if you can only have access to human rights if you have civil rights, and that means you have to be part of a nation state. And we know this for stateless entities like the Rohingyas in Myanmar don't have access to human rights because they don't have civil rights. So I really I'm a big supporter of that as well. I think the reason, or I guess why we have to pay attention. And again, so I'm coming from someone who didn't grow up being taught Indonesian history. I only moved here in my adult years. I briefly was here SMP, but then at that point we started doing IGCSE, so we didn't even have to take history. So all these stories that like are luxuries to me of what it meant to be Indonesian, and all these like genealogies and all these ideas of what an Indonesianness is, I had to study from an outside perspective. And what that gave me was this understanding that Indonesia's a lot, or I guess the Indonesian history and what it meant even before the Republic is a lot larger than we understand, or we give ourselves credit for. Because I know a lot of people were here that are like, oh, Indonesians have an inferiority complex because we were colonized for so long. And I agree with that. But I also want to reframe this, because we have to understand that we were always the prize. Like the spice world has always been, and spice islands have long been the prize. We think about Portugal and the making of the Portuguese empires and how they dominated the trade routes going eastwards to the spice islands. And then we think about the Spanish Empire, which they went westwards to find Spice Islands, and then that led to the New World and the discovery of America and things like that. So I think it's really important to reframe these narratives so we kind of are allowed to feel a bit more proud, where we can sort of learn to move away from having this inferiority complex and kind of have a seat at the table where all the big boys are talking, because we were there. And so I think those are the really important parts. And I was going to say something else. Hold on. Yeah. And then, oh no, I've forgotten. I just moved to breast. No, I had a point and I forgot it. You can, I think, yeah, you can answer now.
Do you, Azza? Okay, I still owe you an answer to the second question on the Bandung conference. I think it's a great question. And yeah, it's definitely possible to read the Bandung Conference as another lens through which to consider Indonesian history as part of a broader global story. And if I could, if you were to ask me what story that is, I think that story is the global history of decolonization. Right? The global history of post-colonial state making, the history of the third world. And surprisingly enough, barring a few exceptions, Indonesia is still not yet part of these narratives to the extent that its size warrants, I think, in a way that's proportional to its size. Right? Recent books have come out, such as Martin Thomas's A Global History of Decolonization, huge book, has very little on Indonesia. This, I mean, scholars have tried to correct this. There have been two new books by Wildan Sena Utama, for instance, who is working on an intellectual history of the Bandung Conference. And he's very much a global transnational historian who's trying to place Indonesia in Indonesia's 1950s moment in a broader narrative. But I think it does raise another interesting question, right? Which is, why isn't Indonesia part of these stories? Indonesia is the fourth biggest country. You know, I get tired of repeating this. When I open articles, when I open my dissertation, I have to repeat, Indonesia is the world's biggest invisible nation state. It's actually tiring at this point, but it's true. Our size does not match the amount of attention we have been given in global narratives about 20th century history.
Biggest invisible.
The biggest invisible nation state, Donald Emerson said in his Foreign Affairs article. I think I thought about this, and I think one of the reasons why we're not part of these stories, even very obvious stories like the global history of decolonization, our story of decolonization was one of the most significant ones in the 1940s and 50s. And I think one of the reasons for this is that, one, and this is just a guess, not many global historians know how to read Dutch and or Indonesian. And it is necessary to have a grasp of those languages in order to write the story of Indonesia into these broader stories. Another possibility is that Indonesia's historians tend to stay in Indonesia and write for Indonesians. I feel like that's another possibility. This has been true in the 1960s and 70s, right? Sartono, Kartodirjo, Hokham, they were trained in the US, some were trained in Australia, but they came back to UI and UGM and wrote mainly in Indonesian for an Indonesian audience. And it's very much a case even today. Right? There are very few Indonesian historians who write for a global audience. And I think once that changes, we will see Indonesia become part of the stories that you just mentioned, especially the most obvious ones.
Right. Yes, I think I like the last statement from Brian about Indonesian historian write for Indonesian. And then suddenly I remember this book. I think it's kind of new book, like it written around this past 5 years or 6, I forgot. The title is Banishment and Belonging by Ronnie Terici. And after I finished the book, I said to myself, like, why not Indonesian who wrote this masterpiece? Because the problem is that this book, I will, as someone who lately delved into philology, I might say that Indonesian historian mostly stops with colonial archives. So they thought manuscript and all sources written in another scripts as field for philologists. And Wayan Jarah Sastrawan, a historian, also said this because our historian is not trained to read old script anymore. So that's why, like our recent the colonial effort, like I forgot the name. Restitution. What's the other name? Repatriation. Yeah, I had that word. Yeah, I'm looking to restitution. Repatriation is really colonial centric because when we want to, when Dutch want to give back a lot of manuscripts that was looted by the Dutch in Lombok, our government give it to Lombok, which actually it's not belongs to Lombok. It belongs to Karangasem Kingdom in Bali. Why we don't give it to, why we don't call it Bali or Karangasem collection, but Lombok collection instead? Because none of our historians who done this action can read old manuscript, cannot read the colophon. Colophon is an information in the end of manuscript that states who wrote this, where, and yeah, authorial information. This is a problem. And then I remember, if Brian talk a lot about Sarpon, I will talk about his student, Taufik Abdul. Taufik Abdul also said like the problem in his PhD thesis, school and politics, about Kaum Muda movement, that our movement in the reformist movement in Minangkabau that day, that influenced a lot of movement in also in Java and other places, and it led to the birth of like Sahadat Islam and other movement. The movement of Muda people, the progressive one, is actually come from Singapore. It's come from a little printed press called Al Imam, but we don't tell it to our kids. Not my kids, I mean, at school. We don't tell it at school because it's beyond our borders. So instead of give them the credits they deserve, we instead look at to the Budi Utomo, which is not anti-colonial. It's just like elite priai guys who have don't say that, but they are cool people though. My point is, we most of the time we don't give credit to those who deserve, and including most of anti-colonial movement based outside of our region right now. Yeah, I think that's what I want to add, and I think about the threat about the national movement in early history during the revolution time. Yeah, it's necessary, of course, because there's a lot of rebellion and other else. But the problem with the way we study history, the way we understand our history, identity, or else, is that we don't give space for adjustment. And nationalism, just like any other idea, someone needs to improve it. And the problem is that we always try to divide us, as Brian says. And if we look into other scholars like Michael Pearson and then Michael Lafan and Sumit Mandal and Sunit Amrit, there's art. So remember, all of them said that have a literal society theory. Literal society theory is talk about how fluid identity for people who live in coastal area. For example, people in Minang, they have closer connection to those in Goa, in southern India, in Kerala, as they both have a matrilineal culture, compared to the connection of Minangkabau with those who live in the highland, even if they live in the same land. Why? Because our imagination is never about geography. Our imagination is about trade, networks, bloodlines, and cool things that I'm not saying piracy cool, but like we are all like Odysseus or something. Like we go to places, and then colonial come blah blah blah. No, you cannot go beyond this borders. Blah blah. After 1824, that's the problem. The way we imagine ourselves is exactly like how the Dutch and English have their own treaty to divide Malaysia and Indonesia in 1824, and we just continue to divide ourselves through this as not me saying this. Traditional say shallow nationalism, so don't quote me. It's actually just like that. Yeah, that's the problem, I think. And yeah, just like what you asked about state and other else, not pretty much stateless, but the power dynamics is not like the social contract in the European idea of society. We have, okay, I will say it like this. Also, practitioners say this, not me. In his book, The Racial Difference in Colonial 19th Century, she said that we say our region mostly like Tanah Air. So Tanah Air is like my place, my homeland. What is Tanah Air? It's evolved. For example, Wajo people, one of Bugis people, during the 1660s, there was a war, right? So Makassar, so Bugis and the Dutch attacked Makassar, and then Makassar gone. And what they do, they just go. They don't want to fight for their own kingdom. So I mean, the identity never related to who you serve for, but it's about your connection and Tanah Air. As far as you go, people talk your lingua franca, Melayu, that's your place. I mean, all of us say the talk, speak the same, I think. Yeah, most of the time. So we are all in our places. And I think colonial ideas that we try to harness this whole time that makes people like, if you don't go back to Indonesia, you're not nationalist. Yeah, that's it. That's what we always hear about. That if we don't pro this state as if we are trader or what. I think that's the point. It's not about that national movement in the early 20th century is wrong. No, it's necessary, of course. But the problem is that we don't move on. We don't try to adjust it a little bit and give it toppings. I don't know what's the name, but yeah, you feel me. So that's it. I think.
I think someone wants to,
Ask a question online. Do you want to unmute yourself?
yes, Ifan Gautama.
Oh,
Yeah.
yeah.
Hi. So thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to ask some questions to the panel. So first of all, I think my name is Ifan Gautama, and I'm a law graduate, currently working in a company somewhere. It's not really important, but the subject is a passion of mine. I graduated as a constitutional law graduate, and so legal history is also one of my favorite subjects in school. So just to confirm the identity of the panel beforehand, because I entered a bit late into the Zoom. So it was Mbak Azza, Mas Brian, and I'm sorry, the other one was the
Auf.
Odysseus guy.
I can call him Odysseus.
Oh.
Auf.
Sorry, Mas Auf.
Mhm.
Yes.
Mas Auf. Okay, right. So I have I'm sorry if this is going to be a bit long because some extra stuff from each of your previous answers. So first of all, my first question is for Mas Auf, and Mas Auf's I think Mas Auf somewhere in his answer referred to how Orang Melayu's identity was defined by how they identify people based on power relationship. I think I could be mistaken when I heard Mas Auf said that, but if it is indeed the case, then how is that so different from how the Dutch treated us as well? Because isn't it the same thing? The way they see, well, this is the Dutch and these are the non-Dutch. Well, if it's how the Malayan people also uh, see things, then how is it so different? So these are the Malays and these are the non-Malays. So in the sense, I'm just trying to see. This is also for myself as well. Do you think then we're not so less colonial than the European powers, let's say, in defining our own identities? I think it's a bit tricky, right? Because yeah, the identity. how do we see ourselves? I think the panel mostly agrees that it's largely affected by our colonial past. But then, if we have been doing that before the Europeans came, then what's so different before and after? And to the second question, and I open this to any member of the panel. I'm purely out of curiosity. How would you define colonialism? I think this is a bit of a snag for me personally as well, because I'm trying to write a journal on Indonesian legal history, and colonialism has to be one of the major aspects being discussed in the article. And this is not just for my journal, but also I think it's an important question for us all, for all Indonesians who kept defining ourselves by our colonial past, right? So we know how we were taught in school. Well, this is colonialism. This is, it's what the Dutch did to us. How the laws are unfair, and how the laws are, for example, in our hukum acara pidana, it's easier for the police to sort of make these discretionary actions which are not as accessible and doable in, for example, the continent, on the European continent. So it's a form of a colonial abuse, right? It's to allow the colonial powers to sort of abuse their authority in the colonial in the colony. So how would you define colonialism? And out of curiosity, again, the same strain as my question to myself. Had we been doing it? Is this something that we have been doing before the Europeans have came as well, based on your definition? And the third question is, what's our framework for a nation state? I think this is a very interesting question as well, especially I refer to the previous participant's question. He said something along the lines of there was a mandala model of government. I remember reading something like that also on Wikipedia, I think. So I'm not really knowledgeable about it, but I know for a fact that our idea of a nation state is based on the Westphalian model. As well, I had quite an extensive public international law background in school, so I'm quite aware of the Westphalian, the piece of Westphalia model that we base ourselves on, the territory. Even public international law wise, we were taught that nation states are defined by four criteria, as the Montevideo Convention criteria. So we have the people, army, government, and people, government, territory, and international relations. So, and this is, of course, a topic for a different discussion, but I was just wondering if how we define ourselves as an Indonesian nation state is already inherently, quote unquote, colonial. And is that a bad thing? Or is there any alternative to this? Maybe this is a question for Azza, who kept on going on the direction of alternatives, right?
Okay.
And last one, also for Baza in particular, Baza mentioned that she quoted Hannah Arendt on totalitarianism, I think, on how Miss Arendt said that human rights require a nation state. So I was just wondering, if did we have human rights before the concept of nation state was brought to us by the European powers? Were there any semblance of the modern human rights that we know today in the past? For example, in Java, maybe in Bali, maybe in Minang, maybe. Of course, I think it's going to be an interesting topic to discuss. So yeah, that's all. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Sorry if it took a long time.
No worries. I think, do you also want to ask a question? Or
Sure. Yeah, one more person.
Oh, okay. Actually, it isn't really a question, more of maybe a commentary. My middle name is Mahayati, so this was like a really um a special surprise. And I actually did like some research on her as a figure. And I actually found like a book in Taman Literasi, the perpustakaan there. It was actually pretty extensive with a lot of manuscripts and fun little details about the negotiations between like the Dutch and the Sultanate. What I wanted to say was that I totally agree with the how our current government, our current leaders, they are really they're really how do I say this, obsessed with basically putting the nation state into the past because um for example, like the Konferensi Asia Africa, there's an actual like um Asia Africa thing going on, but it's in the realm of like business and stuff. And so they're packaging like what we saw as decolonization and putting it into the context of like this capitalist thing that they're trying to build. So they're repackaging the colonialist values into what they are currently doing as a um, yeah, like as a economic power basically. And sometimes I see all of these free packaging adverts, and I feel a bit sad because wow, it's so the distance between what mungkin bisa bahasa Indonesia ya, yang mempeloporkan ide-ide itu dan apa yang mereka apa sih para penguasa itu lakukan sekarang itu kayak jadi gimana ya, ada these betrayal values gitu yang mungkin makanya itu kayak aku senang banget ide deconstructionnya itu karena banyak hal yang kita anggap sebagai oh hal lumrah atau hal yang Indonesia banget gitu. Padahal ya that you thinking of this as Indonesia is the work of all of these people yang apa sih membuat ide Indonesia itu jadinya ada satu singular idea gitu kayak and I think kayak aku kan juga nulis dan banyak banget kayak orang itu kayak orang-orang muda Indonesia specifically sebenarnya ya di Jakarta ya Jabodetabek itu kayak mikirin kayak apa sih aku itu kayak dicerabut banget sama misalnya kayak um, uh, apa sih kampung aku atau even kalau misalnya kamu apa sih kayak lahir dan tinggal di Jakarta itu pun ide hometown itu kayak sangat yang maksudnya kayak orang kan bilang hometown itu kayak di pelosok atau di pulau lain gitu. Tapi kalau misalnya kamu lahir dan besar di Jakarta yang sangat sentuh dengan apa sih globalisasi dunia itu pasti ide kamu tentang hometown itu pasti beda banget sama orang yang mungkin apa sih pindah dari sudut lain Indonesia ke Jakarta gitu. Jadi kayak aku cuma mau bilang this topic is so personal to me and I'm so happy kayak dibuat apa ya kayak diskusi ke ranah umum gitu. Thank you.
Okay, let's keep it at two first, so we can answer. Start. Answer your first question.
That's right. Yeah. I just realized when I mentioned Ronnie Fitch's book, I didn't tell you what it is about. So it's actually about how the experience of people who were exiled in Ceylon, Sri Lanka, and South Africa, and also in India and different places, and Indonesia. Not Indonesian, like people from our place, Tanah Air people here. And then, the writer, she used a lot of sources from manuscript, but what makes it interesting because the reason why it is very hard to understand the experience of non-royal people, because most non-royal people, they don't write diaries like people in the court. I mean, Serat Centini, for example, or Serat Daman Wulan, and also the one that I mentioned, Sejarah Melayu, is mostly show the events of the state. So it's hard to understand what regular people actually behaves in the past, actually think. But Ron and Richie have like groundbreaking invention. So instead of looking at manuscript as just pure manuscript, for example, there's a book talking about hadith, talking about religious teachings. Instead of looking into religious teachings, she tried to understand um, we call it like marginal notes. So it's everything that is written in the margin of the page. So we can imagine that people in the past who have those books, they just write their own like what imagination, like they imagine things and they just write it down during the exile. So it shows like how they think about their belongings, like their identity when they are separated from their own family, and it is very personal. And when I say it about decolonization, I'm talking about people's history, something that we failed to make. Because our history, like the pre-Indonesian, is mostly not about what our people actually, what the zeitgeist of the era, what is the spirit of the time. But instead, we just put it like masa kerajaan Hindu Buddha, masa kerajaan Kesultanan Islam, the Islam Sultanate. Yeah, that's a lot of Islamic Sultanate, but what's their spirit during that time? What's the trend? What is the yeah? It's hard to tell. I mean, something like that, and I think um I find that's the way we decolonize, and so like Ivan asked in the Zoom, he said, so what makes those politics different with Dutch colonial? I'm not comparing about the previous politics with the Dutch. I'm talking about what the spirit of the people, which still stays within us. And we saw our region is as fluid as possible. And the fact that even how we identify ourselves is uh, dictated by the state. I hope that's not a bad sentencing. Yeah, that's the point. And the problem with the colonial framework that we still maintain is that it was built and created not in our favor. So why we should maintain it? I'm not saying like, okay, just dismiss this country. No, I'm saying that we have alternative, just like Brian and Azza said, in the Indian Ocean littoral. Like, why we trying so hard to define us as exclusive? Why don't we make ourselves inclusive as possible as our nature 100 until like 500 years ago, which is, I think it's yeah, that's a problem. We can put our history within this framework, though not in colonial one that we still preserve now. And yeah, if we talk about like national threat, like superpower and like in Iran or America, I think this is the way to promote regional history, because the more strength our the more strong our connection with our neighbors, with those who have connection with us. Yeah, let's say India and other countries like Malaysia and whatsoever. Right? If we have if we promote these narratives, probably we will be much stronger, right? I don't know. It's just me yapping actually, but that's yeah, that's the answer. Yeah, that's it.
There was one other question that Ivan raised, and that is, how do we define colonialism? And I understand that this might carry a lot of weight for you as someone who studies law. One way that I've gone about it, and this isn't the only way to do it, but I found a useful explanation of this in Frederick Cooper's Empires in World History. And I feel like their definition is quite helpful. They see colonialism and colonization as a political structure that is expansionist, so that moves beyond its original borders, usually overseas, and that is structured on two things, which is hierarchy and difference. So a colonial system is a political system which is expansionary and is structured on hierarchy and difference. Hierarchy here meaning, of course, in our case, the Dutch over the foreign Orientals and the Indonesians, and difference being racial difference, with the different rights and responsibilities that ensue, even under the law. That's it. And there was one more question about human rights and whether there were. Do you want to answer that?
Yeah, I can. Ooh, okay. I'm glad you answered colonialism, the defining colonialism, because I've asked professors at times, and even then they kind of just throw back at me, what do you think the difference between colonialism and imperialism is? And I don't know how to answer that properly. So I'm glad that Brian took care of that. On the question of have we been doing it for a while, to an extent, I do think it's inevitable given the like how cair the borders were. People are expanding, but expanding meant going into different territories and enforcing your sovereignty over their sovereignty. So I think in a way, subjugation is always there in history. We have sieges and fortresses destroyed so often. And like real concrete examples of that again is if we kind of return to the Nusantara idea of like that was a word to describe lands beyond the Javanese imagination, and those lands are brought under tributary status. And so is that not still subjugation? I don't know if I'd go for as far as calling it colonialism, but again, these dynamics happen. And even Aceh, even though I'm clearly such a fan and such a big part of my focus, they could still maybe be categorized as an empire. Iskandar Muda had big plans to expand the territory to encompass all of the neighboring islands. And is that not imperial intent? And then he also asked how to define the nation state. I also generally use those four categories. Again, I don't do modern history, so I'm not working at a time where nation states are something I'm necessarily talking about often. But yeah, I would agree that those are the categories I would use. Again, categories made apparent through Europe. We got our sovereignty through the recognition of Europe. And on the human rights and Hannah Arendt, I think human rights as it's used now is not something we see in the past necessarily. If we talk about the Declaration of Human Rights, or like the French Declaration of Human Rights, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, we can see that the way human rights is understood, I think there's a line that's like, the white man is a full person, but everyone else is a third of a man. If I'm not wrong, I haven't really thought about this in a really long time. But like, you can see that that was a really concrete example of what they believed human rights to be. I'm not really familiar with the literature. This is a really hard question. Thank you for it. Lots to think about it. But I'm not really sure if we had works or texts or investigations on what human rights look like before. But yeah, I think what I meant was just in relation to that comment of, and I do like Anderson's work, not Anderson, Arendt's work on this specifically. I also want to say colonialism, the last example of like colonialism is maybe taking advantage of history writing. And I think a really key in like how we then see ourselves, because hello, okay. So I'm originally, if we're talking about where I'm originally from and my genealogy, even though I've only been there once, I'm Orang Padang, like I'm supposed to be Minang. My mom says that we're Padang Basu, which I think is funny. But like Minangkabau is the largest matriarchy in the world. To this day, it's supposed to be the largest matriarchy in the world. And we had a lot of these matriarchal systems. But when oh my goodness, maybe, can I use those? Hello, okay. When the Dutch came, the story goes that they didn't want to interact with any of the female village heads because they didn't think women were supposed to be in those positions, even though they were the ones who owned the land, who controlled societal norms and things like that. So what they did was create positions for men to take up. And through these positions, they were men who originally didn't have necessarily that high place in society. They gave them positions, these artificial positions, to then engage with men rather than women. And then eventually, we had adat writers who were educated in Dutch schools writing about the matriarchy, even though the only ones who were permitted at those schools were men. And we have these men who are completely removed from the matriarchal society, writing history and adat on this matriarchal society. And I think that's taking in a way that is colonial. There's a power imbalance to it, and it's completely written the history and the adat of the culture there. And it's, yeah, a very interesting example, I think, as well. Yeah. We have a chat question, but I really struggle to get back into Zoom through this. There's a yes, Mahtab, if you want to ask a question, we still have time. There's a question for you as well.
Maybe three.
Three?
Just collect it all.
Okay, we have time for 3 more questions. 3 or 2? 3? Yeah.
Hi, so my name is Azza. I have a background in architecture and I've only recently started reading into these, so I apologize in advance if any of my knowledge or whatever I'm going to ask might be a little off. I originally had 2 questions, but I will perhaps condense it into one. And I want to start with an interaction that I had with my professor around maybe 10 days ago. I asked him about a project that I was working on, and I framed it in a way where I said that me and my project mates were trying to redefine nationalism for Indonesia. And then when I was explaining that to him, I said also that the purpose of the project was to do decolonization in what the idea of us as Indonesia is. And he told me to not use the word nationalism, instead to use the word decolonization instead, because he said nationalism was a Western concept. And that I thought that was really interesting of him to say, because he goes on to explain and say that even back then, for example, I also wanted to touch on maybe talk about a bit about the origin of the word Nusantara. It was mostly used in Majapahit records. However, the idea of Nusantara itself, if I'm not mistaken, was Dwipantara something when it was first said by Raja Kartanegara from the Singasari kingdom. And then later on said it was mentioned by Gajah Mada, and he was talking about not just Indonesia, but also the surrounding kingdoms, the surrounding Mandala polities, surrounding Java. So that included like Brunei, Thai, Malaysia, Singapore, all those countries, and they're not very good at geography. So with that in mind, the fact that we have so many cultures, so many overlapping traditions, and it's just a really big country. We are just a really, really big country. So I guess my question is, how do us as a contemporary Indonesian generation build a shared world of meaning without flattening our ancestral identities? So like ancestral identities meaning like pre-colonial kingdoms like Sriwijaya, Majapahit. Sriwijaya and Majapahit, they're often conflated into one, except like it's kind of the whole history between that is still something I'm reading into. Yeah. How do we build a shared world of meaning without flattening ancestral identities or ignoring the international identity that has already been? Right. And like what would that look like? How would we define? Is it possible to really define who we are, define nationalism, if in a way a lot of our history and a lot of the intricacies of our many cultures were kind of erased in order to create the concept of Indonesia? Is it really possible to define nationalism that way? And if it isn't, and if it is, how do we, moving forward, how do we, create a world of meaning for Indonesia as a whole? I think that you might.
Anybody else have a question?
One more. The last one.
Okay, this will be the last question.
Oh, okay. So I'm Prima. My question is like we know like during the Indonesian modern times from 1960s until 1998, how the previous government created an idea of Indonesia and removed every aspect that they I'm not going to say did not like it, it's like too arbitrary, but yeah, you get the idea, right? So the cons the birth of modern Indonesian identity, it's directly created by this narration, right? And until now, we also have this Sejarah Nasional Indonesia (SNI) from which is the Indonesian way of saying that this is us. How do we, as an alternative, what's it called, movement, yeah, fit ourselves in this rigid national history?
Thank you very much. And I think I want to answer both of those kind of at the same time. I agree. I think, again, going back to Ben Anderson's paradox, I'm just going to put it up actually. Like, I think there are two sides of one coin. We have the nationalists who have to make national history. That's kind of their job, but then we can exist as historians and see the alternative at the same time. And so I think the goal isn't to write a nationalism that includes everyone at risk of flattening them, because I don't necessarily think that's possible. Because to have a nation, again, like if we really want to talk about the nation, we can't go further back than 1945, really. And so I think our job is to understand, and this is why I talk about alternative self-conceptions, because perhaps you want a nation. There's Sanjay Subrahayaman's Connected History. We could see ourselves like the connected histories of a trading maritime route, the same as prescribing Francis Bordel's Mediterranean analogy to Southeast Asia as well. And so maybe we don't have to use this national category in this sense, because it seems like maybe Alf mentioned earlier, state and nation is different, and national is a little bit smaller and more micro within this Indonesia. And so what I wanted to say with this lecture is to urge people to see that there are different self-conceptions, and we know that we're a lot larger than this national boundary, and that we I guess, like in the past, like Brian mentioned, the history writing was specifically built for nation making, and there were threats happening, and that it was a defense mechanism. And actually, I had a conversation with a professor, his other supervisor for his MPhil, Maurice Montage, and I was talking about how did the sovereignties in the past hand over the sovereignties to the current state? Like, when did we become a republic? Who took away the sovereignties from the past and brought it to the republic? Who decided and legitimized that? And how is that okay also? And then he said that, oh my, you're functioning through hindsight. You know that you succeeded as a nation. And so you know that, like, we've ended up the way that we have. But then in the decolonial moment, when we were at risk of all these external threats, Suharto and the founding fathers didn't know that they weren't gonna be recolonized. They didn't know that nobody else was gonna come and invade them. Well, of course, there were instances of invasion still, and so they had to build this strong category, which is the category of Indonesia now. And now that we are just shy of 81 years of independence, I think we can say it was a very successful category given the diversity of this nation, but we are allowed to then explore, again, like I mentioned, the parts we've lost to amnesia in this nation building process. Yeah, and so I think the goal isn't to rewrite nationalism, it's to tackle history from different lenses, and not just through one lens. I'm urging people to, who maybe someone can focus on the land below the seas, and someone can focus even on Polynesia. What was East Indonesia and how were they related to Micronesia and like South America even later? And the tomatoes had to come from somewhere, and they came from Latin America somehow. So how did that happen? And then other people can focus on the Islamic relations, and like Rachel Liao focused on the Nanyang. There are so many versions of this that can be done. And I think it's that plurality in Indonesia that makes it Indonesia, if we're trying to find something that's unique about Indonesia. And we can hold so many truths at once. Like, we're the largest Muslim country, but we're also very mysticist. We're like, a lot of people believe in mysticism, and how does that work, given they're quite conflicting? So I think we can hold these multitudes and still trust that the safety of the nation state will hold.
So the lowest currency.
Okay, I think I'll try to answer the question that the gentleman in the back asked earlier. How I understood the question is it possible to have different conceptions of national history instead of making it rigid, a la the Sejarah Nasional Indonesia? Well, I think the answer is yes, but certainly not through state-sponsored channels. And I feel like the failure in hindsight of the SNE project, and just for context, the Sejarah Nasional Indonesia project was a project launched in about 1960 to write what they call a buku babon for Indonesian national history, a book that would serve as the main touchstone for all history textbooks from the high school to the primary school level. And it was a huge project, and at the time, it used up a lot of state resources. This group of historians, led by once again, Sartono Hartodirjo, was sent to Berkeley, to Leiden, to Cornell, to study different frameworks for writing Indonesian history, and to come back and to write the first proper national history of Indonesia. It was a huge project. It was like 5 volumes, I think. But at the end, I'd say almost all of the editorial group ended up leaving the project because what they wanted to write was at odds with what the government asked them to write. And certainly when you operate under such a constricted structure, I'd say, it's very difficult to explore alternatives beyond, a very rigid, moralizing story of the nation state. But it certainly is possible. And I think that what we've been exploring here through Reconstructing Indonesia has been what it would look like to write stories that do not conform to these rigid structures. So with that, unfortunately, I think I have to end your discussion here. But before that, can we all thank Azza and Auf for participating? Thank you for everyone who came. Thank you for everyone who came through Zoom. I really appreciate the effort. Thank you for staying with us throughout their 2 modules, and I hope to see you again soon.
Oh, no.